Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Merv. How are you doing?
Well, I should say good morning because where I am, it's still morning.
Oh,
Where you are, it's
wow.
afternoon. So I think we're separated by about 3,000 miles of ocean in 4 hours. So uh,
Wow, that's right. That's right. You're relaxing this week, aren't you?
this week and next, I decided to take a little time. My wife and I are enjoying, shall we say, the fruits of our labor.
Mhm. Very good. Very good.
But
You
I,
deserve that.
yeah, and I was reminded, you and I had talked, I think it was last week. I don't remember exactly when it was, but we had talked about this whole topic within project management, and maybe it's societal, maybe it's larger, maybe it's societal. Well, I know it's societal, this whole us versus them thought process. And I remember you asking me a question in terms of when I first experienced this sense of us versus them. I'm not sure that I was ever truly aware of it until I kind of thought back. And I thought back to my childhood. This has nothing to do with project management, but kind of develops the concept even from the eyes of a child. And I remember I grew up in an agricultural community in central Canada, and that community was very much inhabited by or homesteaded, perhaps is a better way, homesteaded by large Ukrainian populations, large Czech populations, and large English, Scottish, Irish populations. And I do remember I was second generation, well, actually, probably closer to third generation. My grandparents had come over, brought my parents over as children. But I remember thinking back, my grandparents had very little command of the English language. And by the time it got to our generation being in school, we had very good command of the English language. But it was interesting how my grandparents, and even who were Czech, and even those of Ukrainian descent who could not speak well, were kind of ostracized, often ostracized, whether it was by the elevator agents, those where you brought your grain in, or by the grocery store personnel or whatever. And I remember thinking that it kind of bothered me. I never really thought about it, but I think it was the first time that I ever really experienced us versus them. It was almost like a looking down upon those who could not speak as good English or were always, in their dirty farm clothes whenever they came into town and that sort of thing. So yeah, I experienced it early, and I think that has carried me through or carried on through adult into my adult years and also into my career. How about yourself?
Yeah, the same. When we're early and young, we're us. And there's something happens, and you're right, it's not just project management, it's general human behavior. Something happens between the age of 7 and 9. And we all of a sudden become aware of us versus them, and it becomes binary. And like you said, most of the time, this us versus them awakens a sense of shame and guilt.
Hmm.
I'm different. I'm not part of the group. Now, this makes a lot of sense if you understand the mechanics of the human body. The human body is hardwired to reward us for certain things, right? There are selfish rewards or neurotransmitters, and they help us when we go real fast and we get something, or when we do more than we expected. We actually get chemicals in our brain that reward us for doing that. Now, we also get rewarded by chemicals in the brain when we're connected to our group or our tribe. The neurotransmitter I'm talking about is oxytocin, and you know that, right? It's incredibly addictive, and so we have a huge physical, not just emotional, but a physical drive to be connected to us. And when we all of a sudden we realize we are somebody else's them, it's a threat to this joy. And to give this to a child, or her child experience, this is bad. But you know what? It is so ingrained in us that we don't think about it. One of the greatest talks I heard about this topic was an example of the garbage truck, right? And the garbage truck, those guys out there, them, right? They're making too much noise. And all of a sudden you realize that the garbage man is late because he was taking care of his ill wife, because his wife, had all of these problems. All of a sudden they no longer become an them. They are a thus. And with that us, we can actually connect with them and be rewarded. So it's really funny because it's partly emotional and psychological, but it's definitely found in physiological fact.
Well, and what you just described also, I think I carried into my career, because I remember the early days of IT when we as project teams would get together and we would bring on end users or client subject matter experts onto the team to help us understand the requirements. And I remember very distinctly some of my early projects where some of those subject matter experts or some of those end users, because they were not part of these bright IT, incredibly fast moving technical people, they felt less than. And it was nothing that I recall the IT staff, sort of giving to them that feeling, but they just felt that in the presence of all of these very bright young people. And I think, now you and I have become friends over a lot of the kinds of things that we discuss. And my penchant for people first within project management. And so I think as a result of having experienced their pain at feeling less than, I have now, through my process, through my own projects, felt like I needed to go the extra mile to include them. Because yes, the IT folks tend to be brilliant folks. They're logically oriented, but they can't do the project without those end users who are just as bright and just as capable. They just don't realize it. So I think there's two sides to that coin. One is feeling left out because someone leaves you out. One is feeling left out because you yourself allow yourself to be left out. And so I think we as project managers owe it to just our staff and our client staff to make sure we're always inclusive.
And remember this too. This sets up a game in our heads. When we have us versus them, we have competition.
Oh, yeah.
And, in competition, there will always be a winner and always be a loser. And when you have competition, you don't have a single group. You have factions. And that is what gets us in trouble when we get through our project work, because all of a sudden, pride of ownership and polishing and being good is not for the project and the success of the project. It's to actually enhance others' perceptions of who I am. And that's where projects start getting on these really weird objectives, vanity projects and executives saying this is great when it really doesn't support business need. It gets really wacky.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I remember reading, this was a while ago. I remember reading the difference sort of between our westernized culture here in the US and Canada and, this side of the ocean versus a lot of the cultural adaptations of, say, the Asians or people who are more in the Eastern cultures. And one of the phenomenon that some a social scientist had happened to look at this was that there's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon in the West where we work together as teams, but because tend to be individualistic, our sense of individualism wants us to use the team to gain personal advantage. Whereas if you go to some of the Asian cultures, some of the Eastern cultures, it's very much of a collective approach. And I think what's happening and what some of the research bears out is that, yes, we as individuals, there's some benefits to some of the creativity and innovation as a competitive individual. But the results from that competition aren't as effective as those of the Eastern or Asian cultures, where there's much more of a collective approach to productivity. So it's an interesting phenomenon where even largely culturally, we have these major differences.
And it's scary. It really is scary when you understand the impact and the potential impact for this. For instance, in game theory, we have what I was talking about, which is called zero-sum games, right? I win, you lose. That's competition.
Yeah.
And it heightens the individual. There's another game that you can choose. And this is neither Eastern nor Western. This is just economics. And the other game is, how can we collaborate in order to keep the game going? Now, keep the game going means, can we keep this company in business? Can we keep the economy healthy? Can we keep maintaining our society and culture? Can we actually make decisions that help nature itself help us instead of fighting nature? And when we get into these big pictures, and I'm neither here nor there on these big political opinions, but I'm really interested in the fact that we have these factions in society now, and I'm really interested in how society is going to resolve this, because number one, the individual is rewarded by neurotransmitters for being selfish. And number two, the individual is also rewarded by other neurotransmitters for being unselfish. The parental neurotransmitter, what is that? That's serotonin. And again, we're driven to be selfish by our bodies, and we're also driven to be unselfish. So this same dilemma that's going inside of our physical bodies is being reflected in business and culture and society and government and everything around us.
Well, and I was just thinking, you're familiar with this thing called the Dunbar number.
Yes.
So it's interesting to me. Well, let me see if I can relate this as I understand it. Maybe you can help me through this. But apparently, it's based on some research by a man by the name of Dunbar, and he talked about there's some sort of a limit or a cognitive limit to the number of people with whom you can actually maintain a good, solid social relationships. And when you were talking about the neurotransmitters that reward selfish behavior, as well as the neurotransmitters that reward unselfish behavior, I'm thinking of this research that Mr. Dunbar did in terms of truly, are there those limits to social relationships? And I think he capped them at about 150. And it just reminded me that, certainly in some of the readings, for example, in some of the social, like Instagram or Facebook or some of these, that people get so uptight in terms of the number of followers that they can collect. And if the Dunbar number truly is 150 meaningful relationships, and they're fighting for their 5,000th connection or friend on Facebook, how do you relate that? It's no wonder some of our people are so frustrated these days when they try to collect 5,000 and can't have any meaningful relationships.
And the problem is, you're rewarded, I hate to say this, you're rewarded through endorphins and dopamine when you collect those 5,000. So your body says, get more, get more, get more. Acquisition is great. And it charges you up. And at the same time, you said something very interesting. That Dunbar meaning, the Dunbar definition has meaningful relationships,
Yes.
not just rewards for passing a goal.
Yeah.
And this is where we get sort of mixed up in ourselves. And again, the market plays on this. The mechanisms of sales and marketing have been utilizing this to great disadvantage of the consumers for the last 3 or 4 decades. We knew this. Now, whether it's 100 or 150 people, we can understand that there is a cap to what we can actually call us as compared to them. We're just not wired to handle 5,000 deep, meaningful relationships. It doesn't work that way.
In fact, I'm reminded of a study that someone once said that if you have 4 or 5 deep friendships, that's probably more than the average person has. And when I'm talking about deep friendships, those are the ones that you can confide in, that will look out for you, will have your back no matter what. And I'm trying to relate this now to sort of projects and how, let's say, we as project managers or as project leaders can develop maybe not those 4 or 5 relationships where we confide in each other, but can we have sort of a deeper, meaningful relationship on a project where we collectively or collaboratively can work for the good of the project so that everyone wins?
You know, I've thought about this. And the last 5.5 or 6 years that I was in a corporate job, I was a marketing manager. And in the United States, in fact, at University of New Mexico, there was an economist, and if anybody's interested, hit me up for the name, that developed an economic law called the Law of Diffusion of Innovation. And they said, if you want to influence your community, don't try to influence everyone. He said that there are a significant few, like Pareto, right? There is a few that are great influencers because they are the ones that resonate with your message. And he put it about 16% of the market. And if you can get them excited, not the whole market, not every consumer in the world, just those 16%, they will do their marketing for you. They, through word of mouth, are a stronger marketing device because they have their 16% and their 16% and their 16%. And this is how influencers work today out on the internet to drive opinion and to persuade. They don't try to persuade everybody. That's a fool's errand. They just trigger these meanings in that significant few.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, and if I'm understanding your professor's theory on a project, my last project was 300 and some people. So let's say that I influence just the team leads as the project lead, then I should, by virtue of reaching those team leads, allow them then to influence their teams, who can influence their colleagues, and so on and so forth. Am I hearing that correctly?
That's right. It takes training and it takes practice. But if you have a mature team, agile, if you have people who understand human behavior and certain theories, and this stuff is easily understood over a cup of coffee, you can actually take great advantage of this. And again, think about before the industrial and technological evolution. How did we get things done, right? If you look at England is a great example because it doesn't have one language. Well, it has sort of a similar language, but think about how they use that language and how it's used just 20 to 40 miles away. It's because we were basically distanced by how long a person could walk, which is about 20 miles. And you don't go that 20 miles. So your us is well defined and you share words and thoughts. So what we're getting back to in projects is saying, let's go ahead and connect with our us here as deeply as possible and use them with their connections as deeply as possible, and down and down and down. And that's how we grow it. It's slower, it's more complex, and it's incredibly more effective.
Well, and if you use that kind of an approach, it really isn't us versus them. It's sort of an us extrapolating more us's. If that even makes any sense.
Exactly. And all of a sudden, you're not talking about those silly project managers or that silly janitor or that silly executive. It's us and how can we work together? All of a sudden, everybody's on the same side of the table. You got to start off with that mindset and you got to plan and prepare for that mindset. And I really believe these concepts that may not be project management per se can be incredibly effective and valuable in us getting our work done easily and successfully.
Well, and let me harken back to my original story. Growing up in that agricultural community, I still remember when there was barns to be built, the farmer didn't build his own barn. All the farmers around came and helped build that barn. And it was, it's almost like, I think it's the Amish or those traditions also have barn raising kind of things because they work collectively together And the us is the greater us, not just the particular family.
Yeah, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was the daughter of Quakers, and she was born in 1899, pretty much close to where you were grown. And these people went so far as to share all of their community goods as a community. And when they survived or didn't, it was because everybody thought of us as us.
Right. So here's a question I have then. We've kind of been theorizing, may I use that word, with a couple of applications here and there to projects, but let's get down to brass tacks. Knowing that typically in our culture, when we come together as a group, automatically there are those even unknown, maybe I'll call them biases, whatever it is, even the unknowns, that there ends up being an us versus them formation, even without us wanting to or knowing it, but knowing that that's going to occur, whether all the blondes get together and all the people with 6 fingers get together and all, that sort of thing. But how do we as project managers, how do we as people on projects overcome us versus them so that we collectively and collaboratively perform the project?
First of all, we got to start with the primary source. Okay. What if it's me?
Yeah.
It's the old story of before you can lead others, you must learn to lead yourself. Before you expect discipline from others, you got to expect discipline from yourself. Let me give you an example. I had a guy on my project team that was incredibly confrontational. Okay. And he would do it every single meeting. But what if? But what if? But what if? And after a meeting, I said, boy, you're almost like a canary in a cave. And his eyes, that basically I was saying, I can use you as an early warning system because your tolerance of risk is so low. And he said, that's what I've been doing all along, Tim. I thought I was doing you a favor. And I realized it was my perception of his actions and behaviors that turned him into a them. And once I realized that what I perceived weakness was a strength, then I could pivot my own actions and position him more successfully in the team and in the meetings as, what do you think about this? Can you bring up some alternatives? And all of a sudden, everybody clicked. Once I understood and positioned him correctly, it was great.
Well, and what that makes a lot of sense, because if I look at what a project really is, it's a bunch of people coming together for a short amount of time, whether that short amount of time is 2 months or 2 years or 15 years, whatever that is, there's a period of time. It's coming together to solve a problem, to come up with a solution. In our case, it happens to be automation of some process, of some idea, of something, right? So we're bringing together this group of people to solve a problem. And I think that is probably the best way to overcome any sort of detriments to this us versus them thinking. Because if we're all working together to solve a common problem, we don't have time for a lot of the other petty things that get in our way.
So here's another technique that I've used really successfully, and it's scary. This one gets into neurolinguistic programming. So suppose you have conflict, right? And you have 2 factions in a meeting, and they're facing off on a table, okay? And all of their energy is focused on maintaining their positions. They're not going to budge, okay? What the job of a leader is to help those teams pivot. So all of that compassion and energy that forces them to maintain their positions can actually be utilized to solve the problem. What can I use as a pivot point? Now, we're all taught smoothing is getting everybody into agreement, right? I thought long and hard, is there another side of the coin to smoothing as being just pushing everything under the rug. Is there something that I can actually use to my advantage? And this is the way I've always thought. I know this is a weakness, but I know that every weakness has a strength. And here's what I learned from smoothing. If I can get everybody in the room to agree on one thing, their mind actually triggers. And all of a sudden, everybody in agreement, consensus means we all agree. And subconsciously, everybody in the room says, oh, we're a group. And it doesn't matter what you agree on. We agree on vanilla ice cream. We agree on pizza instead of Indian food family style. If we can get one thing to agree on, off topic, doesn't matter what it is, that's that pivot. So smoothing is a really unique tool if you use it properly and you time it right to actually create that pivot, to take all that energy that they're displaying in conflict and use it to solve problems.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense. I mentioned to you before that we're enjoying the sun and the surf here in lovely Hawaii. I don't know if I mentioned Hawaii before, but years ago I had done a project out here in Hawaii as the project manager. We're actually getting together with my former client, subject matter expert, one of, and we're also getting together with someone who used to work on my project, on my team. And so this is many years later. And so what's happened is it reminded me what you just talked about was how we had come to that sense of agreement using a very direct approach. And that was the state's project manager. His name was Fred Shimabukuro. And Fred had this feeling, much like the entire island of Hawaii, which is this sense of ohana. Ohana in the Hawaiian language means family, a sense of family. And what Fred would often do to get us to work together collaboratively, to get this sense of agreement amongst the team, what he would arrange for weekend excursions or weekend picnics or whatever. But it wasn't just for the team. We were to bring our significant others. If we had children, we were to bring the children. We would set up the volleyball nets. We would set up the hibachis. We would set up the huli huli chicken, all of the kinds of stuff that made for wonderful off camera, off office kind of picnics or kind of get togethers. And it's amazing what just that kind of socialization where everyone was included. The children were important to all of us. Our spouses, our significant others were important. And it's amazing what that did to that whole collaborative agreeing type of socialization once we got back on Monday morning into the project again.
It's complex. It costs a lot of money and a lot of time, but it's incredible the impact that that can have.
And we have to remember that it's not just on the project. We have to be able to work, collaboratively within each other. But even that, Tim, let me ask you another question. That kind of takes care of the global us versus them. But is there any time when kind of an us versus them is okay on a project? I can think of some examples from my own experience, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah. There's authoritarian controls and constraints. And when you go beyond that, you walk into the space of being a them. You have to, by definition. We have to have discipline. We have to have safety. We have to follow laws. And there has to be some boundary that's unacceptable. This is what defines both culture and politics. And that's what creates a formal understanding of a group. And it creates a commitment and obligation. It's like a contract. We even call that social contracts, right? And you have to realize another thing. Leadership is a social contract.
Yes.
Us have to recognize a leader. It's not a person that stands up and says, I'm big and strong, therefore I'm your leader. No, it's the us that defines and assigns the leader.
That's exactly right. And I reminded just of, situations on my own projects where you have this large team. I mentioned 300 or 400 on my over 300 on my last project, for example. Now that was made up of people who were well experienced. That was made up of people right out of school. And there was a huge disparity in terms of age. There was a large disparity even in terms of culture. And often we would end up with small groups of us within the large project collective of the larger us. And it was very useful because, for example, a young man or a young woman who was homesick miles away from their home and from their own from their family or from their friends would form bonds on the project of 2 or 3 people. Maybe they would go and do yoga together, or maybe they would go and play handball together. But those kind of healthy us's within the bigger us, actually promoted team spirit because they felt that they could, yes, work within the larger team, but then they also had this social connection off to the side that they could depend on as well. So we encouraged some of that. And it really worked well for our teams.
Let me give you another example too. Remote
Sure.
working. A remote worker is already a them. If you're working from home, by physical definition, you are a them. You're not part of the internal mechanism that we call the firm or the company. And so it's the leader's responsibility to understand that. So when we talk about remote working in leadership, we teach that it's the job of the leader to, number one, break down those barriers of us versus them and make sure that they understand the position of the remote worker and how they're responding to that experience. And number two, teach the team and train the team to look for these indicators and be able to engage as a group. I usually don't teach at the higher level, what happens when you have 300 people, but yeah, as you expand and the communication channels get really complex, it makes sense to break it into small groups, not necessarily factions per se, but groups of functionality. That's really brilliant.
Yeah, you had to do something because different people experience projects in different ways. And you just reminded me, we spoke a lot I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, maybe it was last week, on remote work.
Yeah.
And as leaders, it is our obligation to make sure them are part of us, because it can get very lonely when all you've got is 4 walls and your desk and your computer. And you don't know when to turn it off and turn it on because you're always on.
Right. And it's really hard. I have a lot of my students challenge me. Why am I supposed to be spending so much time in team building? And what's this ground rule and team charter for? And I don't need to do that. People just naturally do this. Do you think this is something that we can step away from, or is this something we have to participate in?
No, we have to. This is true. There are some people who come together, but when you're on a project team, you have a single vision, a single purpose, and that's to make that project, that's to deliver that project and implement a system. And if you're doing that, it's fine to have people kind of form their own little, I'll call them cliques, form their own processes, form their own little teams, form their own little us's. But unless all of those little us's are working together for that single purpose, you will have chaos immediately. The other thing is, we as humans tend to look for the common. And I'm reminded, my wife and I were on the beach yesterday, and I kind of looked around. I'm an observer of human nature. And as I looked around, I noticed it was kind of locals with locals, visitors with visitors, which kind of makes sense. You would expect that, but there wasn't a lot of mingling. People kind of stuck to their own familiarity. There were young people with young people. There were families with families. In fact, there was, even from a cultural or a racial perspective, typically races with races and ethnicities with ethnicities. There were some different mixtures and that sort of thing, but you could see that people were become kind of attracted to their own familiar area, and they were attracted to those people who with whom they had a lot of commonality. If we allow that on projects to just be attracted to those people whom you are have something in common with, you can suddenly go into that chaos, as I mentioned before, because you don't have that single purpose and single focus without team building, without project managers asserting their vision onto all of the teams.
There's another aspect of that, and you're exactly right. This is something that has to be fostered, and it has to be supported. The other aspect of this is really fascinating. Our organizations and our business and our companies formally define culture. There are two things that drive a project, basically, that shape a project and the way a project works. It's going to be organization preference. They figured out a few ways to do things that are really handy. And there's also business requirement. You have to do it this way, right? With legal stuff and with finance stuff and purchasing stuff. It's basically you have to do this. So those two things a project manager takes advantage of. But the problem is, a project is primarily change, and you're doing something very different. So as a project manager, you're on the edge of the sword, and one side of the edge is you're taking advantage of the culture and the politics of the company. On the other side, you're saying, well, for this project, we have to deviate from this, and here's why. And so the unique nature of this and setting this understanding and this concept actually helps communicate, especially when the team members interact with stakeholders. And the stakeholders are going to say, why do you have to do this, and why do I have to do things different? And we're basically setting up an us versus them conversation, except when you're able to say, we are changing, and we have to do this change because, and all of a sudden this conversation becomes not an us versus them, but a collective us where we can actually work together. It's just natural because of the type of the work it is. Project has changed, and it's going to step out the norms and the boundaries, and it's going to go into the space of them. And we have to be ready for those conversations.
Well, I think that's where the whole concept of change management came into being as well. Because as projects got larger and more complex, even within my own career, from when I started until now, projects have become much more intrusive into the organization. And as a result of that, have required change even with the way people do business. And so I think what you're saying is exactly right. Change management happened. Management was required, and it's incumbent on those who are running the project to be able to work with the subject matter experts who may not have been clued into that vision. They know that there's a new computer system or a new process coming, but if they haven't been clued in all the way in terms of how it's going to change their jobs, it's incumbent on us as project leads, not only to work with our project teams, but also with the client teams to get them sort of understanding what's about to happen to their organization and get prepared for that. Because you don't want to create a worse us versus them if you get my drift, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Oh boy, I certainly do. It's again, preparing and preparation. It's the difference between having a personal plane and taking off from a big airport and having a commercial airliner and taking off. You need a long landing and strip and runway for major projects and major frames. And for my 3-year and 5-year projects, it was like 6 or 7 years to establish that expectation that we are an us and be able to hold those conversations that people normally don't like to talk about.
Yeah. Well, and I have been in my career, I have been on projects where the change has been so substantial that people who have been there for many, many years just decided to take early retirement rather than put up with the brand new process, because they felt themselves becoming very quickly them, the outsiders, the ones who can't cut it. And so rather than put themselves in through that entire learning curve, they decided to change their career or retire altogether. And that was, it's unfortunate, but people make decisions based on even this whole concept of us versus them and their own concept for themselves of who they are in that us versus them category.
Yeah, let's actually talk about change from a progressive standpoint, going from the 20th century to the 21st century and moving forward into we don't even know what's going to happen. Since the 1920s, we've been talking about the fact that things are going to be faster, they're going to be more complex, and they're going to be more uncertain. And all of the futurists have been saying we have to prepare ourselves and others for the unknown. We can't be preparing for stuff that we can predict. We have to prepare for stuff that we cannot predict because we have it nice. The later half of the 20th century was sitting back in an easy chair and letting things happen. And we've learned in the last 3 years that that's not normal. And all my research has taught me that this is not what humans were made for. And we don't learn this, we train for it and we teach for it, and we have to prepare people for it. A lot of there, and this is what's surprising to me. There are two major themes in teaching people how to manage projects right now. It's the training and mentorship, which is part of leadership. You have to be active and effective and training. That includes yourself, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And you cannot rely on yesterday's data solving tomorrow's problem. And on that note, we also have to be prepared for anything can happen day. And basically that's what walking into a project is. And it's, we you and I grew up, and when I was first in project management training, it's crisis management is bad. But with the acceleration of technology and external impacts and business pivots and the instability of society and the economy right now, it's like, it's not crisis management. This is business as normal. And we have to have an understanding that humans are hardwired, and humans have actually been rather successful at these type of pivots through these times in society. And so again, as a project manager, I feel we're in a unique position. We've always been about change. So we can offer this concept of change, not just inside of our projects, but to the community at large.
No, I think that's exactly right. And change has never frightened me because, as you just said, we've been through so much. In fact, we've probably been the instigators of much change that's happened. I mean, I started probably like you did, my career on punch cards. And now we're doing things with artificial intelligence that no one ever dreamed of, perhaps, or very few people dreamed of 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's scary. And
Think about that change. That has been incredible, but has it really thrown you or me off of our game?
well, and think about this. I may have talked about this before, but I remember a CIO when I was doing a data center conversion inside this company, and the CIO stopped me in the hallways and said, "I want to thank you for your advice on this issue I had. I can actually pink slip a third of my IT staff." All of a sudden, Tim is responsible for the future and the lives of 200 IT managers just through a conversation over coffee. And we have to realize that accountability is not just for the success of the project, but everything we say and do and behave, our actions and decisions must be not just right, but ethical.
Well, and how, I can't, this is a troubling part too as project managers, because where do we go with this with this acceleration of how things are happening, with artificial intelligence becoming more and more part of the norm? There will be much more of the citizenry that will be left behind. And in doing so, the divide between us and them, between haves and have-nots, between different cultural groups is going to widen, and there will be more. So what do we do as project managers? What do we do as people?
So if you want history's advice, I can tell you. History's advice says that the middle class will always take care of the poor. It's the middle class who pays to take care of the poor and take action to help the poor. So we are responsible and accountable. Project managers, middle managers, we're responsible and accountable for, the neglected, the not just neglected people, but neglected property, neglected buildings, neglected communities. It's the middle class that's going to speak up. And I'm not saying that we need to teach people this. I'm saying that this is a natural behavior. And it's also the middle class historically that's been the mechanism that fueled the success of society and culture. Whenever leaders have made decisions that shrink the middle class, the ability of that society has fallen apart to actually respond to the needs. And this is something that, number one, we realize how important we are. And number two, we realize how dire it is, not just to be active on our projects. And I'm not saying to be active like an activeness, talking about this publicly either. I'm talking about we need to consider this. Our actions and our thoughts should actually lead us down this path. And it doesn't matter where that path goes. What matters is that we have a good way to make good decisions that relatively come out successfully, because whatever is good for me is going to be good for my group, and whatever is bad for my group is not going to take care of me. So naturally, just through human behavior, we're prone to making good decisions if we know basically how to make decisions.
Well, I think what I'm also hearing you say, first of all, you and I, Tim and Merv, are not going to solve cultural problems that
Right.
come as a result of this, but we can be effective in our own little groups. And I think, to me, if I can sort of coin my own little phrase right here, this kind of came to me right now. What if we turned me versus thee into we? How's that for a little rhyming, little epithet?
That's exactly right. A lot of the people who come to my classes say, Tim, my organization will not allow me to think like this. My organization doesn't give me the time. My organization doesn't give me the authority. I am stuck and I have to do things fast, quick. I cannot consider people. And this is the way things are going to go. And I say, great. And I say, well, they also give you a little tiny Petri dish. And that Petri dish includes things that are going to be different. And that's what we mean by change. And I hereby give you authority and permission to use that as a true Petri dish. Don't try to influence the community. Don't try to influence the business. Don't try to influence your organization. Demonstrate to yourself and demonstrate to your team what happens when you do this. Because I've learned that I don't have to stand up for truth. Real truth stands up for itself. All I have to do is offer people and give them permission to do little experiments.
Well, here, and if your Petri dish is, I like that example, because your Petri dish really is your project team and the process that we're going through to create this new system, this new process, whatever it is that we're doing. And so if we're really, as project managers, we want to change our own little corner of the world, going back to what I was talking about in terms of turning the me versus thee into we, I think there's ways of doing that so that we can address the issue in terms of a common business problem that we're trying to solve. And through that, we as leaders, we as project managers, can show that we care. I think we can make sure that we introduce stability across that team. We can develop that synergy across the way that across the team in terms of how we work together. We can take advantage of the larger pool of ideas that results because we are a team. I think, and I think this almost is contrary to what you might think, but it's counterintuitive, is what I'm trying to say. Is I think there's also a self-direction or self-autonomy that comes out of this because we're trying to meet the goal of the collective, and we're sharing in that success. So I think you're exactly right. If we just take our own little corner of the world, our own little petri dish, and make this happen, I think we can make changes.
Yeah, and again, this harkens back to both Dunbar as well as that 16% in the diffusion of innovation, where I don't have to move the mountain. All I have to do is connect to my Dunbar. All I have to do is, and I don't even have to influence them. All I have to do is demonstrate stuff that humans naturally demonstrate and take advantage of what's already there. Leadership is really interesting. If you actually learn to lead yourself, if you actually learn and teach yourself how to discipline other people by disciplining yourself and practice these skills on yourself, the mechanism is such that you're going to, number one, gain confidence in these skills, and using them, you'll be able to use it easier with others. Number two, people observe this. People observe you being able to do this for yourself, so they trust that you'll be able to do it better with the group. And number two, they'll actually observe the confidence that comes from you. And this moves you magically into the perception of you as a leader. It doesn't happen overnight, but this is the way we make ourselves into leaders, by starting with a known content that we know we can influence, which is ourself, spreading out to our small community inside of our work groups and our projects, and then using that as the influence for the greater thing. And if we do that, we're not confrontational. If we do that, we actually have the people who are friends with the people who we would confront with, convincing them that this is the right way to go.
And if we actually do that, we remove, even from within our own beings, any concept of us versus them. It's all us. It's all we working together to solve the common problem.
And that's the secret. The secret is, especially now, more than ever in our lives, we have to consider, how can we keep this game going? The game of commerce, economy, and the game of groups in the community. This is our survival mechanism, and it has been from prehistory. This we can rely on. This is our strength.
So in the few minutes that we have left, I'm still bothered by the fact that we as humans naturally tend to carve off into these disparate groups. And as a result of that, rather than cooperating with other groups, we end up distrusting, mistrusting, we end up kind of shunning other groups. What are some clues, or what are some ways that we can make sure that those kinds of things don't happen as often as they do right now?
Well, again, I would recommend that we stick with us personally and not try to, influence others. And we actually create a set of scripts. You have a machine up in your head that if you give it something to say, it'll say it 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 times in a row. If you walk into a test and you say to yourself subconsciously, I'm going to fail, that little machine in your head is going to say you're going to fail, 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 fail. If I say to myself, there is a way, and I've read enough history, and I've talked to enough people that I can trust, and they all say this, so I have confidence in this. That little machine in your head is going to say, I have confidence, 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 confidence. And then you can give it tasks. If you make that machine your friend instead of your confrontation, they can actually help you solve problems. Give it a little thing and it'll go off in the corner. It'll come back in a couple hours and say, here's some inspiration. It's wonderful. This is the exploration that we have in making friends with ourselves and learning how to lead ourselves.
I like that thought. In fact, what I'd really like to be able to do is just kind of plant a thought and go to sleep for a while. That way I get my rest and solve my problems.
Have you ever done that?
I have.
Yeah, Bill Persig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance said that. He said, your job as a creator of new ideas is to actually create your mind as supersaturated solution. Okay? Basically, you heat your mind, your intellect, to where it can take too much information, and then you drop the temperature and you go to sleep. And somewhere in your sleep, a little piece of dust hits that supersaturated solution, and boom, the crystallization occurs, and you wake up in the morning. And he said this happens time and time again. It's not Bill telling you this, and this is what he says in the book. It's not Bill telling you this. It's something that everybody discusses who writes books, has art, makes music, or makes decisions. This is the way we solve problems. We put it away. We fill ourselves with too much information and then put it away, and the answer always comes back later.
Or as my immigrant grandmother used to tell me, just go sleep on it. She would say it in Czech, but she would say, just go sleep on it. So somehow intuitively they understood that as well.
Yeah, and all of us gray-haired project managers always say three things, right? Slow down, take a breath,
Yeah.
think it through. Let's go ahead and really take a look at things before we make that decision.
Well, I think everything we've talked about today too goes back to the subject matter of many of our past podcasts, and that is we just need to develop the good leadership skills, those empathetic leadership skills. We talked about EQ or what was the emotional quotient or emotional intelligence a few weeks ago. We just have to develop those, and we have to respect people for who they are. People. They're not different. They're not less than. They're people who are coming together to work with us to solve a problem.
And emotional intelligence is not understanding other people. It's understanding my emotions and how to control them and how I interact with my relationships. And this is a huge message. Look at the definition, look it up. It has nothing to do with understanding others. But when you understand yourself, you automatically understand others.
Well, and I'm just reminded several years ago, I was on a project, and I'll tell this one little quick story before we end. I was on a project where we had co-located our IT team with the subject matter experts from the client. And the major sponsor flew in from another city, the funding sponsor, the group that was responsible for the several $1 million that funded our projects, came in and poked in to see how we were doing, looked in the room. A few minutes later, came out and talked to the director of the organization that we were doing the project for. And they said, who in there is your staff and who in there is vendor staff? To me, anytime that I'm on a project, I remember that feeling from that moment, because I felt that we as a team had accomplished exactly what we needed to do. There was no us, there was no them, it was just we. And we were solving the problem so that even the people who were funding us couldn't tell who was who. And that's what we wanted. So that's my takeaway from this whole discussion and what I use on other projects as I go forward.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you for this conversation. This is a topic that I think about and study and dwell on all the time. And it was really exciting to hear you come from your experience and validate a lot of what we discussed.
Well, I think some of this, and I hate to say this, Tim, but I think some of this we fall into by osmosis sometimes. It's not like we consciously necessarily go and do these things. Sometimes, and maybe it's developing our EQ, but maybe it's that whole emotional intelligence that as we employ that more and more, things instinctively help us to work for better performing teams. So that's
Human nature. Yeah,
yeah, human nature.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, good. I think we should probably end this today. And where can we find you during the week?
I'm over at LinkedIn right now. In the next few weeks, you'll be able to find me in other social media outlets, and we'll be talking about that more later.
Absolutely. And likewise, I'm also on LinkedIn, and I also have a website called People First Project Management. Look us up, give us comments on this episode and others that you happen to find, and just join us every week, same time, same channel, each and every week right here. We'll see you. We'll see you next week, Tim.
Thanks again, Merv, and thanks everyone for dialing in. We'll talk to you soon.